Chocolate? Chocolate! Chocolate!
Hello everybody, and welcome back to the second part of this countdown. If you haven't seen the first one yet, please do before watching this, so you can see my general thoughts on this season as a whole, and what numbers 10 through 6 are on this list, to set up this video. Either way, I'm very excited to talk about my favorite episodes from one of my favorite seasons of any show and continue this list. And maybe give some interesting thoughts on these episodes and maybe surprise you along the way. So with that said, let's jump back into it. Here is my list of the top 5 best Hey Arnold Season 3 episodes. Just cracking the top 5 above of some of its competition in the last video is Helga versus Big Patty. We have seen many episodes on this list so far that show off characters in an interesting way and develop them, and this is one of the best examples. Big Patty is a great foil character. She brings out the best in any character she's involved with, and really gives a new perspective on them. While she might not be the most interesting character on her own, she's just so compatible with other characters, which leads to a really interesting episode. If Rhonda's Glasses was about certain social classes kids get put into at school and is a metaphor for much bigger, deeper meaning things, then this is an episode about how kids will act a specific way to gain a certain persona around everyone else and will do everything in their power to keep that persona alive. For very deep-rooted reasons, even if it's wrong or they're not always trying to, while representing some deeper stuff I'll talk about in a little bit. Both Helga and Patty deal with this in their own way, and it leads to a great conflict that shows just how polar opposite they are, but are also very similar in a sense. And it's such a good character study of both of them through this conflict and Arnold's involvement. How Helga feels the need to be mean to everyone because that's what she did to Arnold to hide her feelings towards him, but now she's doing it to everyone in sight, and this backfires when Big Patty overhears Helga making fun of her. And a huge chunk of the episode is Helga trying to figure out how to make it up to Patty so she doesn't get her butt kicked. And this part of the episode is interesting. It's interesting to see her discuss this with her parents and Arnold, while also seeing how, even though she is apologizing because she doesn't want to get her butt kicked, she does realize what she did was wrong, and does kind of come around on it, and as I said, she does apologize, even if it's kind of fake. And it's really cool to speculate how much of this she's doing to not get her butt kicked, and how much of this is her being genuinely sorry. And this is where a really interesting part of the episode comes in, because you're not quite sure how much you think she deserves to be forgiven because of that. But this leads to Patty revealing her own thing she has to conform to. Because even though she does forgive Helga, she still is gonna beat her up to make sure everyone knows how tough she is. And this is when you've been spending most of the episode debating how you feel about Helga and how worthy you think she is of getting forgiveness. Now you've completely 180'd while watching it, and are just completely stunned that Patty would do something and completely sympathize with Helga. The episode does a good job really showing off how awful Helga is and making you feel bad for Big Patty, so it's so interesting when this happens and it just completely role reverses, and you start to root for Helga here. And the conclusion the two of them come to involving Arnold is so interesting and shows off so much about both of them. You realize they're both kind of conforming to roles they have set for themselves, and they realize they have to be more open to change if they don't want bad situations. They don't have to get rid of these certain roles they have set for themselves completely, but they have to scale it back to a minimum and can't go about every situation with fulfilling this kind of role in mind, which is really interesting and a great conclusion, and Arnold pushing Patty to do this and not beat up Helga and for them to come to a compromise shows that he does really care for her and is really interesting because Arnold is the reason Helga acts like this originally, and Arnold helps her get out of a situation caused by her acting like this. So it's pretty interesting that he was the one who pushed Patty to not beat up Helga, and not only does he do that, but by doing that, it does make Helga and Patty come to a sort of compromise and become closer friends. It's just really interesting and super cool to see all of this play out. Through this story and the conclusion, this episode just says so much about certain molds we try to put ourselves into and how that's not always a good thing, whether they be minor or major, which I think is the greater meaning of this episode's subject matter that can apply to so many situations and people, including teenagers and even adults in cases. Like I said, it's not big things, sometimes it's little things certain people do that isn't truly how they want to act all the time, but just to fit a certain role for some reason. So yeah, this is a great episode that deals with a great subject matter through an interesting plot due to such a great character dynamic which reveals so much about both of them and makes you think about them in a different way, especially a character as defined as Helga. As I said, Big Patty brings out the best in whoever she is around, and this is one of the best examples. But not the best. This episode is the best of both worlds. The best Big Patty episode in the show, the best Harold episode, along with it just being one of the best episodes. I love it so much, even if it is only number 4. But damn, was this a strong enough season where an episode as amazing as this, I can justify only putting it this high up. But alright, why is this episode about Harold and Patty so good? Well, because if the last episode was about certain personas people put on for other people that they keep up for certain reasons, then this episode is about how both Harold and Patty act around others based on how they're generally viewed, and how they both break out of weird molds they have let other people put them in, so they can be friends with one another. It's in a similar vein to the last episode, but it's more about certain molds that Harold and Patty let other people put them in than they choose to be in themselves due to certain things. This episode starts out with everyone being invited to Rhonda's party, and Harold being nervous about going because of how girls think he is dumb and ugly, so in return, he thinks they're all awful. And while Patty was a bit less nervous about going in this episode, the episode still subtly points to her being weary for similar reasons, and it leads to her to not be as fond of boys. This party is a nice setup to show these kids and how their way of thinking towards other people affects them based on past experiences, which is a thing a lot of kids go through, so it's cool to see it shown off in such an interesting way. But through this interesting stuff, we get to see them meet up, and this is where the plot and their ways of thinking gets challenged due to them meeting one another. After they meet at the party while spending time by themselves due to reasons I've mentioned, they start talking and sharing their views on things and realize they both think in a pretty similar way, and come to kind of kick it off, realizing in a sense how dumb their way of thinking was as they talk all night and start hanging out after the fact, and this is where the episode gets really interesting. It's so cool to see these two kids who are very different in many ways, but share the same simplistic kid views on the opposite gender. So it's so cool to see them become closer and closer friends, getting rid of some of those views they previously had in a more subtle way than you'd expect. Using the other person as the thing that shows them that their way of thinking is wrong. This doesn't sound like it would be that interesting, but it's really neat how this episode manages to show off a phase that many kids go through in a way that develops two of our characters in an interesting way by having them come out of that through each other. Their relationship is so cool, and the conversations they have make this plot so much more fascinating. It makes them feel like real people and helps show the progression of how their way of thinking changes throughout the episode, especially Harold. I've never seen an episode tackle a concept like this, which is honestly not that interesting, but makes it one of the best because of how well it dives into the mind of children going through a particular phase like this. Hey Arnold loves to do stuff like this, where it tackles a lot of weird things that dive into stories that revolve around how kids would act under certain situations that wouldn't be interesting, nor would any other show try to tackle because it wouldn't work or it wouldn't make any sense. But this has gotta be the show's crowning achievement when it comes to these kinds of episodes that really just try to get into the mind of a child through our main characters as an example of it. And all this is put in a true test when Harold has to decide if he wants to be cool in front of his friends and stop hanging out with Patty, or break out of the cycle he's been put into, and when he does, it's one of the most powerful scenes of Hey Arnold. Honestly, at this point, I don't really know what I can even add. It's such an interesting episode that deals with such a small and mundane subject matter in a great way and is really powerful for how it develops our characters and makes them come to terms with things when it really shouldn't be as powerful as it is. But damn, it is just so well written and handled. I could try to connect the episode's plot to something bigger, like a lot of Hey episodes, including the last one I talked about, and as they usually do, but I think that takes away from the episode's greatness. It's great because of how simple the plot is, and how what you see is what you get. And the writing is what makes it so powerful, and that's why it's great. I know I might have not spent as much time talking about this episode as I did about the last one, but that's because, as I said, while they have their big differences, as you can point out while watching both these segments, they definitely share a lot of similarities as well, so I got to say pretty much what I wanted to say about both of them while doing each individual section. But with that though, even though this episode once again is great for all the reasons I've stated, there are still 3 episodes to go. Oh man, after all that, talking about 2 great Patty episodes that bring out the best of the character they're paired with, and showing off how people are put themselves in certain molds or put up certain personas and their ways of thinking involving all of that in such an interesting way. How did this episode rank higher than both of those? Yeah, classic Hey Arnold specials are all great, but really, Arnold Thanksgiving this high, you might be asking? If you were asking that question, trust me, I was kinda surprised this episode made it as high as it did myself, beating out stuff like Hey Harold and Helga vs. Big Patty. Because while I have always loved this episode, it did fill kind of a weird void as far as Hey Arnold specials are concerned. I didn't think it was as gut-punching, atmospheric, or as interesting as Arnold's Valentine's or Arnold's Christmas. But I also didn't think it was as fun as something like Arnold's Halloween or School Play. But after rewatching it, man, did I undersell this episode for the longest time. It is really amazing, and honestly, I think it's the most underrated special in my eyes, and is truly one of the show's best on top of that. This episode is just about Helga and Arnold having horrible Thanksgivings for very different reasons. Some of those reasons being a bit overblown, but still reasons nonetheless. And yet you fully understand why they both think their Thanksgivings are really crappy, especially since it looks like nothing like that perfect Thanksgiving they put on in their show. This episode does a good job setting up this plot, showing off why they think their Thanksgivings are awful, and give them an example of what they think Thanksgiving should be. Because all of this comes back later. This actual plot of the episode is just Arnold and Helga walking around talking about how awful their Thanksgivings are, while they try to find something positive about this day, and a way to make it better. And on paper that sounds really boring. But like the last episode, it's not, because the execution is so good. There are 3 things that make this episode great. The first is what I've already mentioned, just how good the setup to all this stuff is. The second is the atmosphere. Well, I said I used to think the atmosphere was nothing to write home about. I actually really love it and think it's underappreciated, like the episode on whole. It does a really good job making you feel like it's Thanksgiving through the more gray and colder end of fall weather and the warmth you feel inside where Thanksgiving is celebrated. It's just so good and really puts you in this time and place. But the big thing, and the main reason why this episode is as high as it is, are the interesting conversations between Arnold and Helga. How you really get to see how these two people who are very different from each other and have such a weird relationship put that all aside to bond over how crappy their Thanksgivings are, while talking about it in an interesting way and trying to make this special event better. There's such a level of rawness to this episode that makes it feel so real, even compared to some of the other show's best. And I like how it shows off what their idea of a perfect Thanksgiving is, and in the end, the episode proves that it's kind of bullcrap in a really interesting way through them meeting Mr. Simmons' family, who the show earlier was based off of. And what really ends the episode off for me on a perfect note is that the moral isn't something stupid like you may have it bad, but others have it worse, so get over it. It's actually about how if you try to level with your family about certain things, and they actually care about you, they will usually level with you as well, even if you have to push them towards doing it. This is just such an interesting message for an episode like this, and it's such a different way to end the episode. Sure, this episode isn't crazy deep or anything, but it's very well written, dives into our characters in an interesting way, and deals with themes of how you view people during certain events and how you want those events to be, which is played around with a lot due to how well they set it up, and when Arnold and Helga realize they were overreacting a bit, it connects to earlier in the episode. And not to mention, this episode is pretty funny. There's a lot of good jokes throughout, especially the stuff that happens in the boarding house. So yeah, I love this episode. I think it's an amazing Thanksgiving special, but even if it grew on me a ton, it was just never gonna be any higher. The top 2 episodes are so good, but man, this one's great too. This is definitely one choice I could see a lot of people raising their eyebrows at. If Gerald's tonsils was the episode I could see the most people disagreeing with me on, then this is the episode I think I'm gonna have to do my best job explaining, more specifically why it's so high. But before I give my reasons, I'll make it very clear that this episode would make it pretty high on just a list of my favorite Hey Arnold episodes in general. It is truly that good for a much simpler reason than the last two episodes were. This episode is sort of like another Pigeon Man, but taken in a very different direction, even if they share many similarities. This episode really isn't about an interesting story, even though the story is pretty good. It's more about a feeling, as corny as that might sound. But trust me, I'm getting to something. The story of this episode is Arnold trying to get an interview from his favorite author, who turns out to be a real jerk who hasn't written anything in years, and doesn't believe it's a good thing anymore. Now, you could say this plot is very simple, and maybe even generic, but like some of the other Hey Arnold episodes, including ones I've mentioned on this list, it's the execution that really counts. I'll be blunt and say there are two big reasons why this episode is so great. The first being the atmosphere. Look, I know, I get it. Hey Arnold, especially in its first 3 seasons, has incredible atmosphere in most episodes, especially in specials like I talked about earlier, but man, is this one of the show's absolute best examples that could go toe-to-toe with the best atmosphere from these early specials. Yeah, I mean it. One of the reasons I compared it to Pigeon Man is because the atmosphere and just how the episode is directed makes it feel very cinematic, but that also very much applies for this episode as well. It just feels larger than life, and it puts you in every little moment the episode shows off. Honestly, this episode is a lot of standing around, waiting for some kind of revelation, but it's so engaging and gut-punching because of how it's represented. From Arnold going to this island, to the weather slightly changing and getting colder each day he's there, how they make you feel the lengths Arnold waits to get his answers because it's just so important to him and makes you really want to see him get them. The atmosphere and the presentation makes this episode so much more engaging to watch and greatly helps the actual substance of the episode, which is the other point I want to make. This episode is just Arnold going out of his way to get answers for his school project, but more so figuring out why this person he looks up to and inspires him isn't the person he wants her to be, or at least expects her to be. And they do this with just a little bit of setup and just letting the visuals of Arnold coming each day as the days go by and the environments change while he waits for his answer with very little dialogue up until he finally gets those answers. And I've kind of hinted at in other videos, but made very apparent in my Arnold's Valentine segment on my season 1 list, that I really connect to episodes that are about people you look up to or have a strong attachment to in some way, how they don't turn out to be the person you want them to be. And the episode shows someone dealing with that in the best way possible. The setup is so good, building a mystery of who this lady actually is and where she is because so little is really known about her, while getting out all this information in a short amount of time and setting up how much she means to Arnold, so when you actually meet this woman and just see how surprised Arnold is, you're so invested just as much as Arnold is to figure out why she acts the way she does. Which makes this simple but beautiful montage so important and incredibly moving. Even though technically not much is happening, the context and presentation really sell it. The fact that knowing why his author, who wrote such inspiring stuff, could be this nasty, that Arnold would wait outside for days just to get this answer, is really powerful. The fact that this means so much to him. I really can't do this part of the episode enough justice. It really is just so moving and presented so well, and I really can't explain it any better than I already have, because it does just come down to how everything is presented. And this is where the episode will really be completed or fall apart for you. It just depends on how into the setup you are and how much the scene impacts you, which it really does for me. But after all of that, Arnold does meet his favorite author, and it is very underwhelming. She just kinda lost her spark and went into hiding. She's not a bad person, just an incredibly sad one. And after all this, that revelation could have been pretty disappointing, but where they go with it is really interesting. Arnold realizes there's nothing he can really do to help her, but admits even after all of this and her not being a great person to him and figuring out she's just kind of a washed up old lady, that she is still his favorite author. This is such a powerful conclusion to come to, and it's so different than what you think would happen. It's such an interesting sentiment to take out of this, how he realizes he can respect her work and enjoy it, even if she doesn't. But I like how this really interesting sentiment leads into our ending, where Arnold writes a report proudly referring to what he found out, and the author being so inspired by Arnold's gesture of how he waited so long just to get answers out of her, that she decided to write an entire book about him, proving just how powerful all this was, and showing that going out of your way to understand what someone's going through, even if you don't come to that understanding, can lead to them figuring stuff out. Just such an act of kindness goes a long way, even if they don't end up being the person you want them to be. This episode manages to take everything it's done so far and end it off in such a powerful note where this author does come around and is inspired by what Arnold has done to better herself. And she was Arnold's inspiration, and now he is hers. It's just so powerful once again, and there's just so much interesting stuff here like this, and it's all so impactful and presented in a great way, making it one of the most moving, complex, creative, and most importantly, best of the series. It really is just that great. I think it pushes the show's boundaries of what it wants to tackle and how it wants to go about it, how it uses the fact that it's a TV show, a visual medium, to represent its story and its emotions and just how it wants to go about things in a great way, because it is just that good, and I've gone on about it long enough. This really is an episode that you just have to watch and feel it, and I highly suggest you do so. It might not click with everyone, and the setup and payoff might not work, but if it hits you as hard as it did me, then damn, you're in for one hell of a ride and one emotional roller coaster because of just how powerful it is, with some of the best scenes in the entire show. But even with all that said, there is still one episode that just does so much more. Yes, that is possible, but man, was this episode so close. But before we end this list, by getting into my favorite episode from my favorite season, here are 11 honorable mentions that just missed the list. Once again, this is the best season of the show. Even with this longer list, there are still so many episodes to give credit to for that reason. Even ones I won't mention here. I really can't do any of these episodes justice. This season is just that good, but like the rest of my list, I'll try. This is the most quintessential Oscar episode, and probably the best. It perfectly sums up who Oscar is as a character and what his shtick is. This episode's plot is pretty good, and it leads to some interesting character stuff and jokes. Once Oscar gets out of his own lazy head and does his job, it feels very rewarding, and the episode does a good job making it feel like a complete, satisfying experience all around. Sure, Oscar's shtick can get a little repetitive, especially when they do this kind of plot in other episodes, at least how it's structured. This episode doesn't look quite as good in comparison, just because it's done a few other times and it's not the best plot structure in the world. But as I said, this is definitely the best version of that plot structure. It shows off Oscar in a fun way, and as I said, he is just pretty funny overall, especially in minor roles, but I definitely think they do a good job with him here, and this episode does enough cool stuff for me to call it great. This would be my honorary number 11. I love this episode. I think the plot is so much fun, the opening is great, the conflict leads to so many cool scenes and jokes, and it's just so intense the entire time with these close calls. It's such a simple episode premise, but sometimes the show just gets the most fun out of these simple concepts, which this episode definitely does. The reason this episode didn't make the list, however, was because there's nothing really pushing it over the edge for me, but once again, I don't have any issues with this episode, and it's just so damn fun and solid, which is why it made the honorable mentions. I like this story, how they set up that Arnold absolutely gets the short end of the stick when it comes to career day, and it leads into an interesting character dive of the Jolly Ollie Man as we're thrown into this fun story involving him, his father, and keeping his job. It's very interesting, but leads to a lot of fun and funny scenes, while at the same time, kind of making you care about this weird dude just a little bit and wanting to see him keep his job, along with Arnold getting an A. There's a few different interesting conflicts going on here involving the main conflict, and it's really cool, and just, once again, a lot of fun. It's not the most complex thing here, but it does show off some interesting stuff, and is a great Season 3 episode overall, using a lot of Season 3's strengths. Not a lot to say about this one. The story is kinda generic, but they have a lot of fun showing off the boarders trying to convince Grandpa not to sell the boarding house, along with there being some good heart to this episode, which makes it worth watching. This is a fun conflict that really fits these characters. I like how the episode sets everything up and slowly builds to Helga feeling more and more guilty about what she made Phoebe do while studying with Phoebe for something that Phoebe should be a part of. For an episode that is just a lot of Helga studying, it's surprisingly a lot of fun and shows off an interesting conflict. Another fun episode where Arnold and friends reenact a war on Elk Island, and it's as entertaining as it sounds. They have a lot of fun with this concept, and we get a lot of great scenes out of it. A very interesting episode that, like most Ronda episodes, deals with how she thinks she is better than everyone, but in this particular case, she holds a party for cool people only and rejects everyone else, which leads them throwing their own party, a geek party. It sounds like a dumb concept, but it's actually pretty interesting and leads to a cool message and look into Rhonda's character and the theme of being inclusive, which they handle really well in an interesting way. Man, I really wanted this to make the list, because it's one of the best Eugene episodes, and I really want to give all of his great episodes their dues before I inevitably have to tear into some of his bad ones. What makes this so good is that it's not about Arnold trying to make Eugene happy and continually failing and just making him more and more miserable. It's actually about Arnold doing one nice thing for Eugene when people are being mean to him just to prove that he's not a jinx and he deserves people being nice to him, and it leads to a great conflict involving them getting stuck on a roller coaster that really has it all. Tension, great jokes, and it all just builds and builds while developing Eugene as a character, and it leads to a very nice ending. This episode just isn't as interesting, however, as the stuff that made the list. Now this is a strange episode. I'm not sure how much I love it, but I like it a lot. The plot is so stupid and over the top, but Phil just sells this one. It's so funny, and the episode gets so much comedic mileage out of its plot, which leads to the most slap in the face of an ending. You know what? Screw it. I do love this episode. Never mind. It's great. On a more serious note, this is an episode that really dives into Miriam and Helga's relationship through them going on a road trip, which we don't get to see much of throughout the series because that's kind of Miriam's character. She does all this work around the house for Helga, but is very distant due to her being an alcoholic. So it's nice we get to see such a great episode showing off their relationship and why they both feel and act the way they do about each other. And throughout all this episode, it just shows off how interesting this relationship is through this road trip, and it leads to many great different things. But I don't think it does quite enough for me to justify putting it on the list. The last honorable mention for the classic first 3 seasons of Hey Arnold. Once again, this episode just has a great concept that leads to many fun scenarios and a great overall conflict, even if it's not the most interesting to watch all the time, and it goes some pretty predictable routes. But all this is small potatoes, because there was an episode that, even in as great of a season as this, shined above all the rest. Surprise! One of the specials made it to number 1, but it really deserved it, because not only is it one of the best specials, but after rewatching it, I realized it's definitely in the running for being the best episode of the series. I know, I said in the season 1 video that Arnold's Valentine's was my favorite episode, but I don't know anymore. It's really close. Though I don't have to decide that today. At the very least, this episode is close to that spot because it's just that good. But what is it about? What does it tackle that makes it better than everything else in this season that I've mentioned up until this point? Well, the episode finally answers questions that people had been wanting to be answered for years. Who are Arnold's parents, and what happened to them? And while obviously we don't quite get into specifics on that second question yet, that's not really what this episode is about. Sure, we get answers about who his parents are, and a simple reason for why they left, but that's more of a nice perk to the episode, and not the big thing it's about. It's actually about showing off how Arnold's parents leaving him affects him, and how that shapes the way he acts, specifically to his grandparents, and how much of a touchy subject it is, especially during certain events, which makes it even harder on him. It's such an interesting deep dive into Arnold's character, and through this exploration, makes him probably the most interesting and complex we've ever seen him in this show, and leads to one of the most emotional and heartbreaking episodes, but also a very gratifying one to boot. I love how this episode sets up the way Arnold views his parents, how his grandpa hasn't really been upfront about who they were or what happened to them, but that's alright, because he loves the illusion of them being these perfect adventurers who do these amazing things. He is cool with his life and how he views them through his grandpa's stories. So you think at first his parents' absence doesn't really affect him, but it deeply does, as you see very quickly into the episode. They slowly show more and more of that off, starting with the announcement of Parents' Day, where all the kids at Arnold's school compete in competitions with their parents, and this makes him very awkward. Because while he loves his grandparents and has a great relationship with them, and they'd be great at this competition, as the episode shows, but it's still a very awkward situation for him, and it slowly builds to much bigger things later. But he does go through with it, and it leads to him having fun at first, until he gets made fun of by Big Bob for not having parents, and an awkward conversation with Helga after the fact. And that's when we get the realization that even if he accepts his parents are gone, his relationship with his grandparents makes him feel awkward in some ways. And there is a disconnect. Because he loves his grandparents so much, he has never asked what really happened to his real parents. And all of this makes Arnold a much more complex character, like I said. But after that, when Grandpa reveals what happened to Arnold's parents, at least what he knows happened, we get this weird dream/flashback sequence where we really get to see how this makes Arnold feel. His feeling towards his parents based on everything, and his grandparents, and how all of this has shaped who he is. How the stories his grandpa has told him about his parents being these people who will help anyone and everyone, even in difficult situations, has made him want to do the same. It's shown in such a nice and creative way, leading to such a powerful scene, and shows off that even if his parents have left such a big impression on him, they're not here anymore. But his grandparents are, and the reason his parents have left such an impression on him is because of them. Even if this makes him feel weird, he still loves his grandparents. They have always been there for him, and love him very much. And now that he knows what happened to his parents, and he's trying to confront this head on, he can put some of this behind him for now. It just says so much, and like most specials, says it with amazing atmosphere and a great presentation, and especially the music, which just really brings it all together. But the episode ends with Arnold and his grandparents going back to Parents' Day and winning the competition against Big Bob with the help of Helga, which is pretty funny, and Arnold realizing he doesn't need to feel weird about his parents because he has loving guardians, but still dreams of flying away and maybe finding his parents one day. Or something much more, like he strives to do throughout this entire show, perfectly bringing the first 3 seasons to an end. Because while I really like the next 2 seasons, and they have their highs, it never gets quite as good as this again, bringing the best season to a close. This episode is so powerful and does so much, and it tackles its subject matter in a really interesting way, and its ending is very representative of the show as a whole, while being very key specific to what Arnold's goals are and what he realizes he truly wants out of this episode. It paints such a good picture of our main character through his relationship with his family, due to his parents leaving, with an interesting plot and amazing emotional highs to boot. It brings all of this together, making this one of the most emotional episodes of the show, and easily the best of season 3. Even with strong competition, this was always gonna come out on top. But even with this interesting stuff in showing how his parents' absence affects him and how that relates to his relationship with his grandparents and him trying to find some silver lining throughout it, and it leading to all this interesting stuff and just showing off all these interesting relationships and his views on life, I think what really pushed this episode over the edge for me, and why I might even consider calling it the best episode of the series, is because of how interesting Arnold is portrayed in this episode. Don't get me wrong, I love Arnold. I think Arnold is a good character, but in a show with such a wide cast of interesting, colorful characters, Arnold does kind of stand out as being a very bland everyman a lot of the time. When the plot is good, Arnold is usually interesting, and at least in the first 3 seasons, most of the time, they try to make him very interesting and not play into his worst attributes, which I think they do more and more in season 4 and 5, sadly, even though I love those seasons. But still, I only think he's as interesting as the plot is. He's a very adaptable character around whatever plot he's thrown in, because he just fits in so well as a nice kid who wants to help people, but a lot of the time, I don't think it says a lot of stuff about him, or who he is. He's more interesting for whatever story he's paired with and how well he fits in, and just interesting things surrounding him, like his home life, and all of his friends around him. But I think this is one of the few examples where we really get to dive into who Arnold is, how certain aspects of his life truly affect him, how it makes him tick, and how it has developed him as a person, and just his moral compass and his values and what he wants out of his childhood and life. It's so incredibly powerful. It's such an interesting depiction of a character who's usually not the most interesting. It's the best portrayal and the best showcase of Arnold. It's easily his best appearance of the series, and that's why I think this episode is number 1 on this list. And with that, the list is done. I'm so sorry that both part 1 and 2 of this list took so long to make and came out much later than I originally promised. I've been very busy with many things in my personal life, but I am still gonna get off school soon and will be posting much more starting in the summer like I promised, including a new series. So I hope this summer I make up for the lack of videos recently. On that note, the top 5 worst episodes of Hey Arnold seasons 1 through 3 will be pushed back due to all of this and won't come out until later in the summer, also because there are other lists I want to make first. The new series I mentioned in my last video will hopefully be the next video coming out, and I've been messing with that idea a lot recently and have turned it into the first of hopefully many lists, but not just on one show. But that's all I'll say for now, in hopes to keep it a surprise. I'll also add it has something to do with early Nicktoons. After that, or I decide to release it next because my new series takes longer to make than I expected, I'm gonna make a list on a show I haven't talked about before on this channel, and it is my favorite show of all time, and I have a lot to say about it, Avatar: The Last Airbender, and the best episodes of Season 1, with my Simpsons Season 6 list following both of those two. I hope you're looking forward to all that, and I hope with the extra time I get, I'll be able to deliver. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, as usual. If you enjoyed this, please leave a like, leave a comment down below telling me what you thought of my list, and what your own list would have been. And please, subscribe to support my channel, and see the new content coming up, I mentioned, and much more similar to this in the future. And with that, I need to get hard at work to finish my next videos in an actual practical manner, and on time, like I said. So until next time, this is Chocolate Guy, signing off.